is what Weber refers to it being, but a certain set of cultural values that prescribe, for instance, hard work in a society, that prescribes a certain kind of rationalism, that as long as you ascribe to these values of rationalism, then you will be a rich and economically prosperous society. And in many ways, what Professor Kopchin was talking about and what Weber talks about in the Protestant ethic is a focus on people, a focus on individuals, right? And the values that individuals they themselves hold to, and the values which in many ways shapes their behavior. What I want to talk about today is a little divorced from people, but rather talk about economics. And talk about, provide for you in one sense an economics 101, but to also talk about another strain of Weberian theory, which we might call political economy. As you can see here from this quote, which he says, capitalism and bureaucracy, right? Government, have found each other and belong intimately together. So in many ways, what I want to provide for you today is a rejoinder to the Weberian notions of the Protestant ethic, to move our unit of analysis away from people and values, and instead look at politics and political economic institutions. And more specifically, what I want to discuss is the relationship between the state and the market, which is, in fact, if you think about it, notwithstanding Friedrich List's inability to write in English, is what you read about this week. It's about the relationship between states and markets. What I want to talk about today has less to do with people and more to do with systems. And what I want to suggest to you is an alternative explanation of economic prosperity, and indeed try to answer then how the rest got rich. So before we move into some more contemporary examples, does anyone know which country's economy was the most dominant economy in the early 17th century? Anyone want to take a guess? Not France. France. Not China. Well, I don't know. Good guess, seeing as I asked the question. But no, not China. Yeah. Spain was on the decline. This was the next economic power. Right there? Sorry? Not Britain. The Netherlands. Right? So, in the early 17th century, this being 1600s, the most dominant economy in the world was not one of the great powers that we typically think of, indeed the great powers we just enumerated. But rather, it was this little country, referred to as the Dutch Republic, the capital of which is Amsterdam. And in many ways, the rise of the 17th century Dutch economy coincides with the decline of Spanish dominance at the end of the 16th century. And there are several reasons as to why the Dutch economy was so powerful at the time. The first was, interestingly, and if you read some of the fiction and some novels, historical novels that are based around this time, one of the senses you get actually is that, especially Amsterdam, was extremely multicultural. Right? This was a place, if you think about it in terms of continental Europe, this was a place in which different ethnic groups from across the continent were meeting and trading expertise, trading knowledge, and indeed trading goods and services from across the continent. The 17th century Dutch economy also coincided with enormous industrial innovation. So one of the things that we know, for instance, about the 17th century economy was the development of wind turbines and the use of windmills as a source of energy. And of course, when you use windmills, and we've all seen pictures of these antiquated things, although at the time they're very sophisticated, this allowed for technologically advanced sawmills. And because of this, we eventually, or effectively, saw the mechanization of industrial production. Not quite the Industrial Revolution that we attribute to the British economy, but we begin to see the mechanization of industrial production. So that you're not just sitting there, standing there with a saw, but rather now you're able to harness the energy, in this case, of wind energy, turbine energy, to actually do a lot of the industrial production that you need for what was then an increasingly modern economy. The Dutch were also pioneers in many ways of modern finance. Have any of you ever been to Amsterdam and remembered it? One of the most interesting things about Amsterdam that I remember is the stock bourse. This was one of the first places in which we saw a modern stock exchange, whereby firms were not owned by families or conglomerates or through direct ownership, but rather companies were now issuing stock, which meant that you or I could buy stock in a company, which meant that company was able to raise capital at a rate unseen before, and could therefore expand its operation in ways unknown before. This was also the era in which a central bank was intimately involved in modern finance, in underwriting loans, for instance, in regulating the stock exchange. All the things that we read about in modern finance today were being put into practice in the 1600s by the Dutch, which allowed, again, for these firms to increase capital, raise capital, to invest money into their firms and to expand their operations. And so it should come as no surprise then that the 17th century Dutch economy was an economy based on trade. The most famous company of which, of course, being the Dutch East India Trading Company. And the Dutch East India Trading Company dominated trade not only globally, as you can see here in terms of the trade routes going all the way to South America, North America, around Africa, all the way to Asia, but also trade routes, and it's not shown here, within continental Europe. The Dutch East India Trade Company not only dominated geographically, it also issued stock, which allows it to raise capital. It used that capital, and it used the industrial innovation to create more ships. By creating more ships, it was able to trade with more countries and bring more goods and services. And it leveraged modern finance to create one of the most sophisticated forms of maritime insurance. If you think about it, back in those days, indeed even today, when you sent out a ship full of goods, there was really no guarantee it was going to make it to where it was supposed to go. So, using the modern financial system at that time, the sophisticated banking sector, they created maritime insurance. You could buy insurance to insure the passage of your goods, which, if you think about it, then mitigated a lot of risk for a lot of suppliers. So in many ways, the 17th century Dutch economy had all of the characteristics of a very modern economy that we would see today. And I want to stress one more thing, something that is typically unheralded, but when you think about it, goes a long way in explaining Dutch hegemony. Little Amsterdam and its economic dominance. And it was this ship, the Vloot. Now this ship in many ways is seemingly banal. It's just a ship. Looks like any ship from a long time ago. But in many ways, this ship was a great source of maritime innovation. First of all, this ship was cheaper to make. It was cheaper to make because of mechanized industrial production. Because now you had sawmills cutting the lumber. You could harness the energy of wind turbines to make these sorts of ships. This type of ship, and I'm not a sailor so I can't explain it, but this type of ship required fewer sailors. It was easier to sail. Meaning that instead of a crew of 50 sailors, you only needed a crew of 20 sailors, which meant you only needed to pay 20 sailors to take a payload out for delivery and for trade. What's also very unique about this ship is that it has a very shallow hull. It doesn't go very deep into water, but rather it's quite shallow, and in fact the hull itself is quite wide. Anyone want to take guesses as to why this would be significant? And why this isn't just completely irrelevant academic minutia? Yeah. Exactly. It allowed, what the point was that it allowed it to trade goods up the river. It allowed these ships to use shallow water ports. So you didn't require those deep, deep water ports, which if you've ever seen any ports being made, requires you to basically explode, right? You just basically have to create these deep water ports for those big ships to come through. Because you have a shallow hull, you didn't need to do that. These ships could dock in shallow water ports, which meant then that they could dock upriver, which meant that they could trade inland. And they could expand their trade then through the continent as opposed to around the continent and through continental waters. And lastly, this type of hull, because it was shallower and because it was wider, had a much larger cargo capacity. In other words, taken together, they're cheaper to make, requires fewer sailors, it has a shallow hull, meaning that it can go to more places, and it has a larger cargo capacity. It meant then that this fleet of ships was able to provide trade and services at a much cheaper cost. It was able to reduce the cost per unit, if you will, of traded good. And because it was able to provide it at a cheaper cost, it allowed the Dutch East India Trading Company to gain wider markets. And it was because of this, then, that the Dutch, for the first 50 years of the 17th century, were able to outcompete the British. The Dutch were quite simply able to provide the same goods and services at a cheaper price and outcompete their main competitors, the British. In other words, then, when we think about it, the 17th century Dutch economy and the sources of its hegemony is, in effect, the market principle in action. The first principle is simple. If you increase the supply, if you can supply more, then you lower the cost per unit. And if you lower the cost per unit, you decrease the price. So if you can increase the supply of Barbie dolls, if you can increase the supply of iPods, if you can increase the supply of rice or wheat, you can lower the cost per unit, and by lowering the cost per unit, you make the price to the consumer cheaper. If you are able to lower the price, and you're able to take advantage of what we call economies of scale, if you're able to provide more, if you're able to provide a larger scale of goods and services, you can decrease the price, and by decreasing the price, you will increase consumption. More people will buy. If you increase consumption, you increase trade, and by increasing trade, you increase your market share. Now I want to stress, this is very simple economics. In fact, it's a key. This is not a value system. This is not something that is simply and only the domain of Protestants. This is not even a normative view. This is just simple economic market principles in action. And for the same reasons that we see the rise of the Dutch economy in the 17th century, we can see exactly what's going on with respect to the Chinese economy today. And I just want to show you a little clip from Frontline, just so you get a sense of what we mean by economies of scale.
To see firsthand how the promise of a vast new market for America was playing out, I headed for China and the heart of its new industrial revolution. Shenzhen, South China's miracle city. 20 years ago, this was all rice fields. Today, it's a sophisticated city of 7 million. Its astonishing rise, orchestrated by China's leaders, and ignited by a Chinese currency devaluation in the mid-90s that dramatically lowered its export prices.
It's the opening of China. China is a communist country, and for the longest time we had closed doors. And when they opened up to Western businesses, the floodgates opened, basically. And it's something that you just can't stop.
The boom seemed endless. North of Shenzhen, I found an entrepreneur who was among the first to spot opportunity in the new China.
Well, these are the products we make. This gives you some idea of...
Australian Donald Hay came to South China 20 years ago.
I was in this part of the world and I saw the cheap products come out of Japan, and I saw then that market went to Korea and then went to Taiwan. I said, hold it. The next one's China, I've got to get here.
The backbone of China's new industrial might is the flood of young Chinese pouring into this industrial province, an area no bigger than Missouri, now teeming with more than 40 million migrant workers. They come to work and live at the factories. At Hay's company, HAECO, they make $100 a month, or about 50 cents an hour. Other companies pay as little as 25 or 30 cents an hour.
They want to work, they want to earn the money, they want to get forward. And they will do anything to move forward.
Today, HAECO supplies electric toothbrushes and home cleaning products to big American companies like 3M, Procter & Gamble, and Walmart.
What's happened is the world has come here as a marketplace. It's like a supermarket for manufacturing today. And the quality is up to world standards and the long way past world standards. And that's just what's happened in southern China.
All across the region, I saw evidence of the mass corporate migration into China. Highways lined with factories like airport hangars. Hundreds of billions of dollars in Western investment have poured into China in the past 20 years. And Walmart is here too. It has 35 supercenters in China, and behind one of them, here in Shenzhen, I found Walmart's Global Procurement Center, a huge buying operation tapping directly into China's new workshop of the world.
I interviewed people in Walmart's Global Procurement Center in Shenzhen, and I asked them about the total number of Walmart suppliers, and I was told that Walmart has 6,000 global suppliers. 80% of those suppliers are in China.
Several hundred employees work at the procurement center, keeping the import pipeline full.
Walmart gives Chinese suppliers the specifications for Walmart products, and they teach those suppliers how to meet those specifications. They have to do with price, they have to do with quality, they have to do with delivery schedule. So in a sense, Chinese suppliers learn how to export to the U.S. market through large retailers like Walmart.
The Chinese suppliers also learned just how tough Walmart can be.
Walmart is, they're very shrewd people. They know that they have the volume orders behind them, and they can go into a factory and almost demand, these are my demands, this is what I need. And
Kenneth Chan is a Hong Kong entrepreneur who used to supply Walmart.
I've even heard sometimes that they will call in 3 or 4 manufacturers in one of their little negotiating booths and auction them off, say this is what we want.
the big reverse auction kind of thing where they bid the price as low as possible.
What do they do?
Basically, they bring people into their offices and just put product in front of you and ask you to everybody to bid their costs on the product. And it's very high pressure.
Have you ever been in that situation where you had to bid and 3 or 4 people in the same room?
Yeah, I have. A lot of the things that I was involved in, they're very, very inexpensive. They're probably at the most maybe less than $1.
So they're pounding for a few pennies.
They're only pounding for, in a lot of cases, just 1 penny, in fact.
Great. So a couple of numbers in that very short clip. 40 million migrant workers, right? 40 million migrant workers who are working usually without contracts for now benefits. Wages about 50 cents per hour, and can be as low as 25 cents an hour if you go further inland. And 80% of Walmart's global suppliers, and I think in many ways Walmart's represented in most large firms, 80% of Walmart's global suppliers are located in one country. So in many ways what we're seeing here is the market principle in action. What we're seeing in China is the lowering of costs, and the lowering of costs by lowering wages, by having workers work longer hours, by providing fewer benefits, and by leveraging, frankly, more abundant labor. When you're talking about a country with 1.3 billion people and 40 million migrant workers looking for jobs, you can leverage more abundant labor and effectively then decrease the cost. And again, if we go back to market principles, you decrease the cost, you increase the supply. By increasing the supply, you decrease the price to the consumer, which of course is, in many ways, passed on to you as the consumer in the form of savings, and retained in the coffers of firms in the form of profits. This is, in many ways, the key to the market economy. And in many ways, the efficiency of the market economy. What we have here is the classic price function, in which you have a demand curve. This is basically economics 101. A demand curve, a supply curve. Where they intersect is considered an equilibrium, and where they intersect is considered the optimal price. Now, the way in which this graph works is, for instance, if you increase the quantity or the supply, and you assume the demand curve stays the same, if you increase the supply, then you expect the price to go down. And the expectation then is that you will increase demand, and you will increase consumption, and you will in turn sell more. And again, I show you this to demonstrate exactly how the 17th century Dutch economy worked, and exactly how the Chinese economy today of the 21st century is working. They are, as many would argue, a function of the efficiencies of a market economy. If we take then these principles of the market economy, we can derive from them some generalizable laws, if you will. And these generalizable laws are the laws that we hear pundits use all the time. Whether it be Tom Mulcair or Conrad Black. The first generalizable law is that when we assume that demand is constant, consumption is a function of price. In other words, we're rational consumers. The lower the price, the better. Now, interestingly now, some of you might say there is some great research being done out there, the type of work that I've been working on as well, in which we're actually seeing consumers are willing to pay a higher price if they know that that higher price is covering things like corporate social responsibility and so on. But generally speaking, as rational consumers, consumption is a function of price, and the lower the price, the better, which explains then why we scramble to Buffalo to buy things at what we presume to be a cheaper price. The second law is that an increase in supply decreases price. But the question is, how do we increase supply? Well, as we've seen with the example of Walmart in China, we increase supply by decreasing our input or factor costs. We make it cheaper to make. And therefore, by lowering the input costs, be it the cost of labor, land, or energy, we increase supply. We increase supply, it decreases the price. And if we're all rational consumers, then according to the first law, we'll consume more. The third law is the antithesis to that. That is that if there is a decrease in supply, then we should expect that the opposite also is true. That is, that if we decrease the supply, then we will increase the price. And if we increase the price, then again, according to the first law, then we should see, generally speaking, lower levels of consumption. So, for instance, if you look at the energy sector, and oil specifically, when we see a decrease in the supply of oil, the number of barrels being produced today, we see an increase in price. And as consumers, we either bear the costs of this increase in price, or more typically, we consume less. Or we also might try to find alternatives. But the point I'm trying to make here is that we as consumers are sensitive to price. And price is in turn sensitive to supply. A change in supply equals a change in price. A change in price equals a change in consumption. So, taking it all back then, if we're interested in the question, how do economies become rich? We have to ask ourselves, how do economies make things that people want to buy? In other words, we need to focus on the supply side. We need to focus on how we supply things in order for an economy to get rich. The key point here is to get rich, you need to sell something. You need to supply something. And Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations presented himself as one of the most influential thinkers in this regard. As you all know, according to Adam Smith, if you want to get rich and you want to sell things that people want to buy, then you have to allow the invisible hand of the market to rule. The invisible hand of the market. What you want to have happen, therefore, then, is the intersection of supply and demand. You want these markets to be unfettered. If you believe in this, if you buy this principle, the invisible hand of the market, then you as a consumer, whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're a firm or whether you're a country, there are some implications of the invisible hand of the market. The first implication is that you have to make what you are good at making. You have to make and supply those things in which you have an advantage. So the classic example oftentimes used by Smith and his disciples like David Ricardo was basically saying, look, the British are good at making textiles, so make textiles. The Portuguese are good at making wine. Let the Portuguese make wine. There's no point in the British making wine because British wine, if you've ever had it, is terrible. They don't have an advantage in it. And the Portuguese don't know how to make textiles well. They don't have an advantage in that. So the first law, or the first implication is, you make what you're good at. You take advantage of your comparative advantage in the market. What this then leads to is the second implication. If Adam Smith is right, if you should only make what you're good at making, then this should lead to specialization. So you read this great piece written back in the 1990s about Barbie and the world economy. And as you saw, this Barbie doll, which is sold, in Western markets, is in fact a product of many different countries' contributions. Whether it be the oil producers in the Middle East that's providing the chemicals for the plastics, to the manufacturers in China, to the retailers in the United States, different countries specialize in different parts of the production chain of that one Barbie doll. And for Adam Smith and people at his ilk, the argument basically is this leads to efficiency. And if it's efficient, and if the production of that Barbie doll, or if the production of that drug, or if the production of that iPod is efficient, then we're able to lower the cost By lowering the cost, we're able to lower the price, and if we lower the price, then we will consume more of it. So if the invisible hand of the market is